What if everything you've been taught about perfection is wrong? Meet Lorenzo, a master sculptor whose hands could transform stone into life. Yet for 15 years, he's been paralyzed by the pursuit of perfection. When he finally selects a massive block of marble, he chooses one with a flaw that others rejected, a gray vein running through pristine white stone. Why would a perfectionist choose imperfection? Because Lorenzo is about to discover the secret that all great masters eventually learn. True perfection isn't created by what we add to our lives, but revealed by what we have the courage to chip away. In a village nestled between mountains and sea, where time seemed to move with the deliberate patience of the tides, lived a sculptor named Lorenzo. The villagers knew him as a man of few words and steady hands, whose modest workshop stood at the edge of town, closest to the ancient marble quarry that had provided stone to artists for generations. Lorenzo was neither young nor old, perhaps 50, with lines around his eyes that deepened when he smiled, which was seldom enough that children sometimes made games of trying to earn this rare expression. What the villagers could not see was the weight Lorenzo carried within, the relentless inner voice that drove him to seek perfection in each piece, the voice that whispered, "Not enough," regardless of the mastery others praised in his work. The narrator observes how this pursuit of an impossible standard manifested physically, the slight tension he carried in his shoulders even in repose, the way his eyes constantly assessed and measured everything around him, the unconscious habit of his fingers moving as if to reshape the very air before him. Lorenzo's reputation had grown steadily over decades of dedicated work, his sculptures gracing gardens and piazzas throughout the region, even finding homes in distant cities. Yet the piece that had haunted him for nearly 15 years remained unrealized. His masterwork, as he called it in private moments, though he had never spoken of it to anyone. In his mind, he could see it with perfect clarity, a human figure emerging from raw stone, caught in the moment of awakening to consciousness, both part of and separate from the marble that gave it form. He had made countless sketches, dozens of small clay models, yet had never begun the actual sculpture, always finding the available marble somehow lacking, his skills not quite sufficient, the timing not exactly right. The narrator perceives the deeper truth that Lorenzo himself could not acknowledge. His hesitation stemmed not from external conditions but from fear that the culmination of his life's work might prove disappointing, that the gap between vision and execution might be unbridgeable, that in completing his masterwork he might lose the dream that had sustained him. The catalyst for change arrived unexpectedly, in the form of a letter from the capital city. The National Gallery was planning an exhibition of the country's greatest living sculptors, and Lorenzo had been invited to present a new, significant work. The letter, written in elegant script on heavy cream paper, concluded with words that seemed to pierce directly to his private thoughts. "We believe you have a masterpiece yet unrevealed to the world." The narrator reveals Lorenzo's physical reaction, how his hand trembled slightly as he set down the letter, how his breath caught somewhere beneath his ribs, how he moved to the window of his workshop and stood looking toward the mountain that contained the quarry, its pale face catching the afternoon light like a silent challenge. After decades of delay, circumstances had finally forced his hand. The exhibition would open in 1 year, time enough to create his masterwork, but not enough to hide behind further preparation and postponement. The following day, Lorenzo ascended the winding path to the quarry, a journey he had made countless times throughout his career, yet which now felt weighted with unprecedented significance. The quarrymaster, Matteo, greeted him with familiar respect. "The usual size?" he inquired, already moving toward the smaller blocks that Lorenzo typically selected. But Lorenzo shook his head. "I need something larger," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "The largest perfect block you can provide?" Matteo raised his eyebrows but asked no questions. Something in Lorenzo's demeanor discouraged casual curiosity. Together they moved deeper into the quarry, where massive blocks of newly cut marble stood like sentinels, their pristine surfaces gleaming in the sunlight that slanted through the carved opening in the mountain. The narrator observes how Lorenzo moved among them with reverence bordering on caution, his fingers occasionally brushing against a surface, his eyes distant, as if seeing not what was before him, but what might emerge from it. Finally, he stopped before a massive block nearly twice the size of any he had previously worked with. Unlike the others, this one was flawed. A faint vein of gray ran through its otherwise perfect whiteness, a natural variation in the stone that most sculptors would avoid. "This one," Lorenzo said, laying his palm flat against its cool surface. Matteo began to point out the flaw, but Lorenzo interrupted him. "Because of the vein, not despite it," he said, and would explain no further. Transporting the massive block to his workshop required assistance from 6 men and a team of oxen. The entire village turned out to watch its slow progress down the mountain path and through the narrow streets, a spectacle that hadn't been witnessed in living memory. Lorenzo walked alongside, occasionally guiding the ropes that secured the marble, his attention never wavering from his chosen stone. When at last it stood in the center of his workshop, dwarfing everything around it, an unexpected silence fell. The helpers departed, the curious onlookers dispersed, and Lorenzo found himself alone with the enormous block that would either become his masterpiece or stand as testament to his failure. The narrator reveals how, in this moment of truth, Lorenzo experienced not the anticipated fear but a curious sense of homecoming, as if he and this particular stone had been destined to find each other, as if the gray vein that others saw as a flaw was actually a map leading him toward the figure waiting within. For days, Lorenzo simply lived with the marble, circling it at different hours, noting how light played across its surface from morning to evening, occasionally marking a line with chalk, only to wipe it away again. He slept on a simple cot in the corner of his workshop, rather than returning to his home, unwilling to be separated from the block even overnight. Food appeared at his door: bread, cheese, wine, left by villagers who sensed the importance of what was unfolding within the workshop's walls. The narrator observes how this period of apparent inaction was in fact a time of intense internal activity. Lorenzo was seeing the sculpture from every angle before removing the first fragment of stone, understanding that each cut would be irreversible, each decision would limit all future possibilities. On the 7th day, he selected a chisel and hammer from his extensive collection of tools, each worn to fit his hand through decades of use. With movements that contained both certainty and humility, he approached the block, placed the chisel against the upper right corner, and struck the first blow. What followed was unlike anything Lorenzo had previously experienced in his long career. Rather than executing a predetermined plan, he found himself in conversation with the marble, responding to what each cut revealed, allowing the stone's natural properties to guide his decisions. The gray vein that others had perceived as a flaw became integral to the composition, sometimes defining a shadow, sometimes suggesting a boundary between flesh and stone. Lorenzo worked with unprecedented intensity, often forgetting to eat or sleep until physical exhaustion forced him to rest. Yet paradoxically, this intensity was paired with a new patience. He never rushed a cut, never forced the stone in directions it resisted, never tried to impose his will where the marble suggested a different possibility. The narrator perceives how Lorenzo's relationship with perfectionism subtly shifted during these months, from seeing it as an impossible standard externally imposed to recognizing it as an ongoing dialogue between vision and material, between control and surrender. As word of Lorenzo's project spread, visitors occasionally appeared at his workshop. Collectors, fellow artists, the merely curious. Most were politely but firmly turned away, but a few were admitted, among them Sophia, a young sculptor from a neighboring village who had once briefly apprenticed with Lorenzo. She observed his work in respectful silence, then asked a question that no one else had thought to pose. "How do you know when to stop removing stone?" Lorenzo's hands stilled on the half-revealed form before him. "The sculpture is already complete within the marble block," he replied, quoting words attributed to the great Michelangelo. "I am only chipping away at what doesn't belong." The narrator reveals how this ancient wisdom had taken on new meaning for Lorenzo through the months of work. He was not creating something from nothing but revealing what was already present, participating in an unveiling rather than an act of pure creation. His task was not to force the stone to become something else but to listen deeply enough to discover what it already contained. The work progressed through seasonal changes, summer heat giving way to autumn rains, then winter's brief chill, and finally the return of spring as the exhibition date approached. The figure emerging from the stone was both exactly what Lorenzo had envisioned and entirely different. A human form awakening, yes, but with a complexity of emotion in the face that had not been part of his original conception, a tension between emergence and return in the posture that spoke to something deeper, than he had consciously intended. The gray vein that others had seen as a flaw had become the defining feature of the piece, weaving through the figure in a way that suggested both wounding and illumination. The narrator observes how Lorenzo himself was being transformed alongside his creation, the lines of tension in his face softening, his movements becoming more fluid, his rare smile appearing with increasing frequency as the sculpture approached completion. Just 2 weeks before the sculpture was due to be transported to the capital, Lorenzo faced his final and most difficult decision: when to declare the work complete. Each day he removed less stone, his cuts becoming increasingly delicate, focusing now on nuances of texture and surface. He found himself reluctant to finish, not from fear of failure as before, but from a different emotion altogether, a recognition that completion would mean separation, that the intimate dialogue between sculptor and stone would end. On the final day, he worked until sunset, then set down his tools with deliberate care. The narrator reveals the complexity of emotions that passed through Lorenzo in this moment: pride without arrogance, satisfaction tempered by the knowledge that perfection remains forever out of reach, and a profound gratitude for having been part of a process larger than himself. The sculpture's journey to the National Gallery and its unveiling at the exhibition became the stuff of village legend. How 6 oxen had again been required to transport it, how crowds gathered in every town it passed through, how Lorenzo had walked the entire distance alongside it, refusing all offers of more comfortable transportation. But what the legends did not capture, what only the narrator perceives, is the internal journey that paralleled the physical one. With each mile traveled, Lorenzo found himself less attached to how the sculpture would be received, less concerned with external validation. The masterwork had already given him its most precious gift: the experience of true collaboration with his material, the understanding that creation at its highest level involves as much listening as expressing, as much revealing as inventing. The exhibition opened with great ceremony, attended by critics, collectors, and artists from across the country. Lorenzo's sculpture occupied the central position in the main gallery, impossible to miss, yet somehow creating its own space of quietude amid the social bustle. Opinions varied widely. Some declared it an instant classic, others questioned its departure from Lorenzo's established style. Still others debated the significance of the gray vein that wound through the figure. Lorenzo listened to all with the same attentive equanimity, neither defensive in the face of criticism, nor inflated by praise. The narrator observes how he stood slightly apart from the swirling conversations, his eyes repeatedly drawn back to the sculpture itself, rather than to those discussing it, still seeing not just what he had revealed, but all that remained concealed within the stone, the infinite possibilities that every choice had simultaneously created and foreclosed. Months later, long after the exhibition had ended and the sculpture had been acquired by the National Gallery for its permanent collection, Lorenzo returned to his workshop and the rhythm of daily work. But something fundamental had shifted in his approach. He still created pieces of great beauty and skill, but the driving perfectionism that had both propelled and tormented him for decades had transformed into something more sustainable, a recognition that mastery is not a destination, but a continuing journey of refinement, that the highest achievement is not flawlessness, but authentic engagement with one's material. New apprentices found him a more patient teacher than his earlier students had known, more willing to allow them their own dialogue with the stone, rather than imposing his vision. The narrator reveals how Lorenzo had internalized the central paradox of his masterwork, that perfection is not achieved by adding elements until nothing more can be added, but by removing what is unnecessary until nothing more can be taken away, leaving only what is essential. Years passed, and Lorenzo grew old in the village of his birth, his hands eventually becoming too arthritic for the demands of marble, though he continued to work with softer materials and to teach those who sought his guidance. On his 80th birthday, the National Gallery invited him to revisit his masterwork, now considered among the country's greatest artistic treasures. Standing before it, Lorenzo experienced a moment of profound recognition. The figure emerging from stone had become a metaphor for his own life's journey, the process of gradually discovering and revealing his authentic self by removing all that was extraneous. What parts of yourself are waiting to be revealed beneath the excess? What masterpiece might emerge if you approached your life as a sculptor approaches marble, not through constant addition, but through careful, loving subtraction? Share in the comments below what you might need to chip away to reveal your truest self, and join our community of seekers discovering that our greatest growth often comes not from becoming more, but from having the courage to become less.